Whenever you get here, go ahead and just let us know that you're joining the chat. We've got the booths there. Hello. Hi, Jerry. Nice to have you. I'm going to just see if I'm smart enough to paste something while we're waiting on folks to come. Just for curiosity, I put a post there about somebody talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his surprise in how things were. So anyways, that's something that Jerry read this week, and I thought that was kind of interesting. We'll give a couple of minutes to make sure that people get here, get signed in. Thanks, Jerry. Good morning to you also. I guess there's two Jerrys. Jerry Bowers, Seagull. Again, we're just giving a couple of minutes, maybe not even a couple minutes, a minute or so, to let everybody get here who can get here. If you're wondering about the headphones, it's because I'm trying to just make sure that the audio quality is as good as we can get, even if that means weird things hanging out of my ears. Hope everybody's had a good week. I don't know about everyone else, but I'm certainly starting to feel. I'm going to break the rule and scratch my eye here. Please don't tell any medical professionals. Also some, kind of warnings just as we're waiting for folks to join us as we really get started here. I was called by Tom Blazina this week, who informed me that on Wednesday night he was taking his cursor and sticking it up my nose. That is not appropriate Facebook behavior. So please keep the cursors away from my face. And so Tom called to ask for forgiveness, and I'm still considering whether I will, in fact, forgive him for that injustice that he committed against me. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started here and just move along. So our class title is One Ways That Social Distancing Can, in fact, make it easier to follow Jesus. I think we can probably all think of disadvantages or issues or problems about how things are more difficult right now. And again, that's something certainly that I'm feeling and sensing, kind of starting to feel tired of this already. And who knows even how far that we're doing it, obviously missing the church family. But there is one thing that I think it makes it easier right now, but it also is something that I think that it's helpful for us to pay attention to at a time like this. I had a friend in high school who was one of those guys who would never let a challenge go unmet. If somebody told him to do just about anything, and we're not talking about immoral things, just basically dumb things, he would almost always accept the challenge. So that could be eating something. I remember one occasion where he jumped off this high branch of a tree into about 3 feet of water. He would just kind of do those sort of things. And there seems to be people like that if you give them a challenge and they know people are watching them, that they're going to go ahead and do it. And so I want us to just explore a little bit, and you can go ahead and use your comment feature about why do people, when others are watching, do things that don't make any sense? So again, use your comment feature, and just wanted to have a little bit of a virtual discussion here about why are certain people more prone that when somebody challenges them to do something, they're going to do almost anything. So what are your thoughts? How do crowds influence behaviors? I do have tea here this morning that's going to keep me moving and well-fueled while you're commenting on attention to impress people. Yeah, so there is, I think, even within all of us, there's this desire to impress people. So we're kind of having a discussion here about why do crowds influence behaviors, and why do certain people do almost anything as long as there's somebody there to challenge them and to watch them. To gain popularity. Yeah, Alan, I think that's a great recognition that people's view of you will change. Okay, peer pressure. Yeah, just this desire to say, okay, at least I fit in, or I'm accepted in this way. So peer pressure is something that kind of allows crowds to influence our behaviors. What else? Other thoughts on why do you think? For approval. Yeah, just simply we want to be a part of the in-group. You want to be accepted or to see. And so, I would guess that all of us, to differing degrees, probably have that propensity or that tendency, that we share that same inclination, that we may perform differently when others are watching than when we're on our own. So if it comes to like a food challenge and you see a dead fly, the likelihood of you eating that when you're by yourself is hopefully fairly minimal, especially as compared to when other people are challenging you or saying, hey, you should eat that. And so I think that there's a part of our DNA, and I think that it probably varies in terms of how much we can be influenced by all of that. But there is this inclination to perform differently when others are watching. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at some lessons from the Sermon on the Mount that I think point out some ways where social distancing can actually make it easier to follow Jesus. And that's, what is discipleship like when there's no crowds to perform for? I mean, we're really at a very interesting kind of place in our church experience where this is a Sunday morning and there's no one. Well, I guess no one. Here I am in front of a camera, but there's no one that's going to be watching you. There's no one that you're going to have to feel like that you're is impressed by you. I mean, all of those sorts of things. And so we're going to look at Jesus's teachings about how really this kind of crowd pleasing performance can be a challenge for us. And so in some ways there's a benefit because we're at least not having that temptation right now, simply because we're not around other people. So I want us to look at Jesus' teachings in the Sermon on the Mount regarding performance and discipleship. So we'll be reading, first of all, from Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 through 20, where Jesus says, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorns or figs from thistles? In the same way, every good tree bears good fruit, but every bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will know them by their fruits." Now, I think that there's this importance of realizing that in order to inspect fruit, you have to be trained in what kind of fruit you're looking for. Because in some ways, depending on what you're looking for, there is in this passage, there's misleading fruit. So where do you see in Matthew 7:15 misleading fruit? If you're not a perceptive fruit picker, what are some things that you can look at in this passage and think that maybe good people or maybe bad people are in fact good people? So where do you see where fruit can be deceptive in Matthew 7:15 through 20? If you're not trained in looking for the fruit, what might you miss? I mean, I think the first thing that I recognize is beware of false prophets. So we are talking about people here who are prophets. And the fact that we need to be aware of them or watching them closely or attentive to them is because they must be prophets from within the Christian community, not without the Christian community. So what we are talking about here is people who have infiltrated the Christian community. And they seem to have these positions of whether it be leadership or notoriety. And wolves can dress like sheep. Would you that you would accept anything they say? So we have these insiders who produce at least enough fruit that they're like, oh, this person is a prophet. And then there is a job to determine whether they are, but they dress in sheep's clothing. So if you're not a very good fruit inspector, that these will be people who you will attend to and that you will listen to, because there are at least some fruits that seem to indicate these are authentic or genuine people. So they produce a certain kind of fruit. There is a way in which they look like they are the kinds of people that God wants or desires. So when we lived in New Guinea, one of the things that we learned about fruit, yeah. So Alan is talking about if you're just looking at the outside of the fruit. So again, if you're so that actually kind of leads into this example. When we lived in New Guinea, we bought almost all of our kind of fresh fruits and vegetables from the market. And the thing that's amazing when you go from American grocery stores to the market in New Guinea is the fruit in America looks amazing. In fact, that you know that they've gone to exorbitant means to make it look really, really good. So you have the misters, and they have these little dots of fine mist on the fruit in the American grocery store, and you pick them up and you look over them, and yeah, this fruit looks great. That we tend to buy our fruit based on what looks the best. Now in New Guinea, in the markets, their fruit does not actually look all that amazing. The bananas are not this kind of pristine yellow that you'll see in our grocery stores. They will already have some brown even as you're buying it on them. And the tomatoes will be kind of like misshapen and have these extra growths that the colors may be off. But it's really funny when you watch an American or somebody from North America shopping at a market in New Guinea, is they'll pick up a fruit and they pick it based on how it looks, and almost all of the New Guineans will snicker at them, because they all know this is not the best tasting fruit, but it is the best looking fruit. And so we, from our culture, tend to make the same mistake, which is we look at the fruit based on how it looks, where the New Guineans are like, I don't care how it looks. Why? Because I'm going to eat it. The food is not a visual thing. Its significance is in how it tastes. So for those of us going from America to a New Guinean market, we are not properly trained in how to be fruit inspectors. Because we only have one criteria, that when you take it to a different culture everything's not about the presentation of the food, you're going to make a wrong mistake. And I think that what Jesus is going to be getting at in the Sermon on the Mount is to help us to know how to be proper fruit inspectors, to help us to know how we're going to be able to judge and evaluate fruits there. Now, so if you're not trained by Jesus, what do you think that you might look for in people? So if you are not a trained fruit inspector and you're looking at other people, what do you think are some of the things that we might look at or weigh or evaluate them based on? Who do you know who is doing good, or who do you know who's doing, who is a good follower of Jesus? So what criteria do you think, if you're not trained in fruit inspection, do you think that you might use to decide whether someone is good fruit, producing good fruit or bad fruit? So go ahead and use the comment section. What are some things that you think that a person might? These are not necessarily even right answers, but what might people who have not been trained in Jesus' fruit inspection look at and say, oh, this person clearly is an outstanding person in the Christian faith? What fruits might people look for? Untrained people. Yeah, Alan says just doing the outside good deeds. People who say the right words, eloquent speakers, people who can impress the crowds or the audiences of people. What else might we look for if we haven't been trained by Jesus in fruit inspection? Yeah, somebody who goes to church every Sunday. Attraction. Yeah, people who just they have this charisma to them, or they have this personality that people are attracted to them. Any other thoughts about things that we might look for if we haven't been trained by Jesus in fruit inspection? Yeah, those who are charismatic. And so when we see this, Jesus talking about false prophets, and we see Jesus warning people about those in sheep's clothing, one of the things that we have to realize is we have to have the right fruit inspection process. Because if we don't have the right fruit inspection process, we're going to be severely disadvantaged in doing what Jesus is doing. Here's an interesting question for you to think about. I don't necessarily want you to answer it, but the question becomes, how do we choose elders? Do we choose elders based on a deeper inner spiritual quality, or do we tend to use some of these kind of attributes or characteristics? They speak well, they are in front of groups of people. How do we choose ministers? Do we do it based? I mean, the easiest thing for us to measure, I think we just have to be honest, the easiest thing for us to measure is all of these external, all of these outside things. But I think Jesus really does help us to look for the right kinds of fruit. So we're going to go back now to the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to just kind of follow it through, where we see that Jesus is actually continuing a theme that he's had throughout the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus begins this is not at the very beginning, but early in the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 5:20, Jesus says, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of God." So one of the things that we're going to find in the whole Sermon on the Mount is Jesus is going to differentiate between true kingdom living and fraudulent kingdom living, which I think is Jesus' way of saying there is a way to pull this off, this thing that we call discipleship, this thing that we call Christianity. There is a way to pull it off, and it can look like the real deal. It can look very, very authentic. And so the first kind of feature of this fraudulent kingdom living is a fraudulent righteousness. So you say, okay, well, there's righteousness and unrighteousness, but Jesus is saying there is a kind of righteousness that we can do that is not the same as the righteousness that God calls for in the kingdom. So, again, Matthew 5:20 says, "For unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." So one of the things that we realize is that the scribes and Pharisees have a kind or a type of righteousness, and Jesus is saying, but that righteousness needs to be exceeded, which I think for the original hearers of that message would probably have been just overwhelmed. How does one's righteousness exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees? Now, the next thing that Jesus will do over the next section here is he's going to take several examples of exactly what he means, of exceeding that righteousness. And so we will have those examples in Matthew 5:21 through 48. So go ahead and look over that text, and where are some areas where Jesus is saying righteousness was understood in this way, but when I'm talking about righteousness, I'm meaning this instead. So come up with, you can just give even section titles, but where are some things where Jesus says, here's one type of fraudulent righteousness, but true righteousness is going to go deeper. What are some of those examples between chapter 5, verse 21 through 48? Go ahead and just use the comments feature for your answer. Or places where Jesus said, you think this is what righteousness looks like, but it actually really looks like this. Here's one example, Matthew 5:21. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. So, what does the fraudulent kingdom member do? They do not... I've got a text here asking if I can reword the question. Yeah, what does the fraudulent kingdom person do? They simply don't murder. They say that's the level of righteousness, and that becomes the standard that they choose to live by. But Jesus is saying, because Jesus is not trying to undermine or throw out the law, Jesus is saying, I have not come to abolish the law, but I've come to fulfill it. And so true righteousness comes through obedience of the law, but not through an obedience that stops at just simply not murdering. Jesus will call us into something deeper, where he will say, but if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And so each of these examples, anger, adultery, divorce, oaths, retaliation, treatment of enemies, these are all examples where there is a fraudulent kind of righteousness that you can embrace and that you can live by in the kingdom. But what Jesus is doing is he's saying people are producing true kingdom fruits. They're not going to just produce surface obedience to the law, but they are in fact going to pursue the intended kind of motive and obedience to the law. Yeah, so what Jesus is calling for is a changed heart. And again, as we look at the difference between a fraudulent righteousness in the kingdom and true righteousness, that's going to be really hard to begin to evaluate, isn't it? When there are always constantly people around, it is easy to do the surface level elements of the law. But the question is, underlying all of that, is there something deeper within us? So that's the first main section is Matthew 5:20, where Jesus, that's kind of like his introductory statement or his thesis for the section going down through verse 48. And then he takes another new section in chapter 6, verse 1, and now he's going to introduce the next section that follows. And so in chapter 6, verse 1, Jesus is going to now talk again about another kind of fraudulent righteousness, and he's going to compare that to true acts of righteousness, or your Bible translation may use the word piety or something like that. But Matthew chapter 6, verse 1 says, "Beware of practicing your piety before others in order to be seen by them, for then you have no reward from your Father in heaven." Now, somebody explained to me how this can be the same Jesus who in 5:16 said that we should be like salt, that we should be like a light on a hill to be seen by others, and now he's warning us about the danger of doing acts of righteousness in order to be seen by others. What do you think is at the heart or underlying the difference between 5:16 and Jesus' warning now in 6:1? (5:16), in case you're wondering, says, "In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." So yeah, we have motivation, we have motive, we have intent. That there, and again, these aspects of motivation and intent, that's a part of the fruit that we're trying to look at, right? But as a fruit inspector, motivation is really hard to inspect for. Motivation is really hard to look for. And so in Matthew 5:16, I mean, one of the things, and this is the first time I've ever noticed it, this is R.T. France in his commentary says that the word that's used in 6:1 is different than the word in 5:16. The 5:16 is a more neutral word about people kind of taking notice of you. The word here in 6:1 is in order to be seen, which is the intent is to create attention, to draw eyes to us. And that points to the difference in the mode of 5:16 is to give glory to your Father in heaven, whereas the examples we're going to see in chapter 6:1 are in order that people might see our good deeds. Now, this is where we're starting to get the heart of why there's actually an advantage for us as we're not meeting together, as we're not social distancing, is the crowds are gone. If you are doing your acts of righteousness to be seen by men, guess what? There's no men or women to see or to notice or to observe it. And so what we're recognizing is this creates a whole different context for us as Christians. We are living in an age where there's going to be nobody out there to watch you. And so there become some opportunities. Now, after chapter 6, verse 1 of Matthew, we start to see some examples of things people can do in order to be seen by others. So go ahead and look in your Bibles from Matthew 6, 1 and following, and there's 3 examples. And I will give a thumbs up to the first 3 who can get any one of the 3 things that people might do in order to just simply be seen by others. So go ahead and use your comment feature. What are some things that you can do that are talked about in chapter 6 that people are doing, and it can be just to be seen by others? I'll remind you from one of the things I've been learning is my comments tend to pop up. People are saying 20 to 30 seconds after they see it. So the first thing we see is this act of alms or giving to the needy. Our prayer can be something that is what we do. So I did say I'd give a thumbs up. So Mona or Steve, you guys, if you're together, that's for you. Stacy, if there's other booths there, that's for you. And what's the last example of what we can do in order to be seen by others? There's giving, there's prayer, and there's fasting. And there's a thumbs up for Lori. So each of these become ways that we can fraudulently do what God's calling us to do. So none of these are examples of saying like giving to the poor. We'll just use the word alms. Giving alms is a bad thing, or prayer is a bad thing. Nor is it to say that that fasting is a bad thing. But it is saying that each of those things behind them, what can be driving us and what can be motivating us to do it, is simply the crowds. So there is an encouragement in each of these activities to find a way to do it with a private element to it, to do it in secret, where God, who is everywhere and sees all things, can see and be aware of it. So if we are doing it in service to God, then it doesn't matter whether there's an audience or a crowd there. We're going to keep doing it because we know that God is our audience. We know that God is the crowd, per se, that we're seeking to please and to desire. So again, what is a gift of social distancing, being stuck in our houses right now, is it gives me a chance to say, if I'm lethargic or tired about doing acts of righteousness right now, that it may be the Holy Spirit trying to illuminate that maybe something's been motivating me about the crowds, about doing it because people might be seeing me or might be watching me. See, there's a difference between what's done in the fraudulent kingdom and what's done in the true kingdom of God. And so one of those things is concerned about the present. I want my alms to be noticed here in the present. I want my fasting to be noticed here in the present. I want my prayer to be noticed here in the present. Whereas what Jesus' orientation for all of these things is your Father in heaven will, future tense, reward you. It's kind of like how Jesus started the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes. That there are those who are currently in a certain situation, but they will encounter in the future a new situation. So it is entirely possible we can get so stuck in just this present moment and to say, here's what I need in this moment. I need a reward from the attention of people, and that's going to be my driving feature. But kingdom-oriented people are saying, I will do what is good and right in order that in the future there might be this blessing or that there might be this reward. One can be concerned about who's getting the attention. Are people getting the attention, or is God getting the attention? Now again, in our time of social distancing, as we're in kind of lockdown mode, God is fully aware of all our ongoing acts of service, our acts of righteousness. And we don't need to shy away from that word. I mean, the literal language is doing righteousness. So while we are at home, we don't need to shy away from doing righteousness. We continue to do righteousness, knowing that our Father, whom we're seeking to please, He's the one who's watching and He's aware of it. And so it helps us to understand whether we're doing things in service for ourselves or doing things in service for God. I'm going to go now to the next page here. So I think that the skill that we need to develop is looking past the outward fruits and moving into the inward fruits. See, Jesus makes it clear that discipleship means a great deal more than religious activity. Jesus is saying you can participate in everything. You can show up. You can even lead in all of these things and still not be producing the kinds of fruit that really God is looking for and that really God is desiring. So we're going to go back now again to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, to Matthew chapter 7. And now we'll look at verses 21 through 23. So Jesus is giving warnings about the kinds of people inside the kingdom who we need to be attentive to. And the first, of course, was false prophets who dress in sheep's clothing. That unless you know what fruit to look for. So now as we talk about those false prophets, we actually now have some fruit training. So if we say, okay, here's the people who are the true prophets. These are people who are giving a lot of money, and we can tell that they're giving money. These are people who are constantly up front praying, and these are also people who are fasting. They're doing these exceptional deeds of righteousness. Those have to be the fruits that we look at. And Jesus has spent the sermon warning us, you can follow the law on this surface level and yet not be pursuing God, because the law can draw us deeper in terms of obedience. Rather than just simply not murdering something, we're being called into to not having hatred towards others. And then Jesus has said, if you don't just look whether there is alms and prayer and giving and fasting that's happening. Jesus is saying, what's the motive? What's happening behind all these things? So he's been training us to be fruit inspectors. He's going to give us one more example as people in the kingdom that there might be these dangerous things. So Matthew chapter 7, verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. On that day many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many deeds of power in your name? Then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Go away from me, you evil doers. So these are people who will claim allegiance to God, and they have things they can point to back it up. What are some of those examples that these people can point to as proof that they are righteous kingdom people? So go ahead and use the comments feature. What are the things that these people might point to? What's their resume items that they say, clearly I'm in a right relationship with God? I feel like I should be saying this advertisement is sponsored by Members Mark. You'll see my Members Mark up here. Okay, visible works. So what kind of visible works? What are the specific things that people are pointing to, saying, if this is on my resume, clearly, okay, so yeah, that's the one. They prophesied in his name, they performed miracles, and there's one more. I'm going to assume that somebody's already typed it. It's coming up late, but casting out demons. So what we have is people who they can show impressive, charismatic, and what I would call very visible public fruit, right? Like that's the commonality of all of these things, is they are very visible. So where would you tend to see all of these things? Prophesying your name, casting out demons, doing many deeds of power. They're the kinds of things that you would expect to see in front of groups of people. And Jesus has been saying in chapter 6 that you can perform or you can act out righteousness, and it's not righteousness. And so Jesus is just simply reinforcing that point by taking some things that, hey, I'm going to say I would be impressed if you prophesied in his name, if you cast out demons, and if you did deeds of power, you would impress me. I'm far more likely to go to Facebook and say, here, look what I just saw. This guy just got up and he did this miraculous deed, and I'm going to get a bunch of likes. See, if you want to fraudulently create a certain persona in the kingdom, all of these kinds of things will be the kinds of things that you look at on your resume. Now, instead of these things, prophesying in your name, casting out demons, and doing many deeds of power, what does Jesus say that he is really looking for? What is the true heart of what Jesus is seeking? Instead of those who say, Lord, Lord, he's looking for, of course, those who do the will of my Father in heaven. Okay, so is prophesying not doing the will of the Father? Is casting out demons? The disciples cast out demons. Is doing many deeds of power in your name? Again, the early Christian evangelists, the apostles, they did deeds of power. So how is that not following the will of God by doing those things? And I think what we're getting at is that the intention here is knowing a person and having a relationship. That doing so in order to know, how does one come to know the will of God? Some of the ways that people have been suggesting we come to know the will of God, Jesus has addressed earlier. Jesus has suggested that the way that one can come to know, this is in chapter 5, the way that one can come to know the will of God is by knowing the law, inside, outside, upside, downside. And to then be obedient to everything that the law says on this level here. But that's not sufficient, because if you're serving the law as the law in an end in and of itself, then you can miss the intention or the purpose of the law. And we could give lots of examples. We're not going to do that now, but we could give lots of examples in Matthew where the scribes and the Pharisees are saying, hey, we are doing law, and Jesus is saying, yeah, but you're not doing intention or purpose of the law. Have you not heard that I desire mercy and not sacrifice? Jesus will say that twice in Matthew to the scribes and to the Pharisees. So to do the will of my Father in heaven means you need to know the Father. One way to know the Father is through the law. What we do learn about the law is how God cares about people, what God's values are. The law becomes a means of knowing God, but the law itself is not knowing God. You can be a lawyer who is defending someone and you know all of these things about them, but you don't know their true will or their true intention. So to know the will of my Father puts this as a personal relationship. So again, one can do all of these external acts of righteousness, and yet if they don't know the heart of God, if they don't seek the heart of God, then it can all just come up really empty. And so Jesus will say to those who just simply have this impressive resume, I never knew you. And again, this very personal, relational language. So God is calling us to live everything we do out of our knowledge of who He is as a person, not as a legal code, not as a prescription of, do this, do this, do this, but because I know Him and I know what He's expressed, this is the way that I live to Him. And I'm going to avoid all of these just simply external things that others are taking as criteria for this is the kind of a person who really knows God. But so as we get ready to conclude here, I want us to just talk about how we can receive this gift God's offering us. And the gift that God is offering us is the gift to say, what's really driving you? What's your true motive? How do you... And I know this is going to be really hard to do in the comment section, but do your best. What are some things that you do to help notice your motives? See, when Jesus says in 6:1, He says, beware. Some translations say beware. The word means to take care or pay special attention to practicing your piety before others. So Jesus is saying we need to be really, really self-aware. We ourselves need to be really careful about our motives. So how do we begin to know our motives? Jesus, if it was something that was so easy, obvious, evident, Jesus wouldn't call us to be careful to be sure that we're not doing it that way. But the fact that Jesus says care is needed here, so we have Gay saying getting into the Word. Yeah, as we encounter God through His Word, one of the things is it may illuminate our motives and may even convict us of some of our motives that might not be from God. What are other ways that we begin to identify our motives? Yeah, we can recognize our selfishness. Sometimes if we have an opportunity to reflect on something, we can look back on it. So Jerry's mentioning sitting quietly and listening, that maybe we create a space in our lives where we look back over our actions and behaviors and we ask ourselves the question, what was behind that? What was driving me? What were my motives behind it? So here's another question that I want us to think a little bit about. Notice other people's reactions. And that actually leads into this question is, sometimes I've heard people say things like, Here, I'm going to just do some comments here first. Ask the question, why am I doing what I'm doing? And even Alan, I think that's a great idea. And as we ask that question, we pray for the Holy Spirit to really open us up to it, because we can sometimes deny it. Am I seeking approval, attention, or affirmation? And so we have these, I think, Michelle, having these kind of set questions. I'm just kind of go through this sort of thing. Asking ourselves, is it beneficial to others or just for me? And so does this bless other people? So I've heard people say they're just doing it for show. You ever heard anybody say that? Oh, that they're just doing it to get attention, or they're just doing it for show. So my question is, how do you begin to evaluate if somebody else is doing it for show? How do you know? So what are some criteria you use, not just in evaluating yourself and evaluating others? Examining how you feel about it. I think feelings are a way that God does communicate what's really happening in our heart. And so looking back and saying, what kind of feeling does that create in me? Anybody else thoughts about judging others? So maybe nobody wants to put it there, but I'm just simply going to put it out there. People have said, I can tell that you're doing this for a show. And I struggle to know how a person really knows that. The Sermon on the Mount is saying that you can tell when a person is a false prophet. You can tell when they are sheep in wolves' clothing, but the way we tell it has very little to do with the public performance or the public kind of persona. It's something to do about what's happening deep in a person's heart. So I think that there's a way to get there, and I'm just not sure exactly how we do get there. And as I say that, it's also important to realize Jesus' warning in Matthew 7 about the danger of judging, especially judging when we have a plank in our own eyes and we're so concerned about another person's speck. But we are asked to evaluate fruit. I mean, I think that's one of the things that Jesus is calling us to, is to evaluate the fruits, but we have to make sure we've been trained in being fruit inspectors first, because otherwise the fruit we look for may simply be the wrong fruits. I'm going to just close with, there's a guy named Bernard of Clairvaux. He's an old dead guy, and he talks about the 4 degrees of love, and I find this helpful whenever I start looking at motivations. Number 1, he says, is loving yourself for your own sake. So what he calls selfish love. That if we are doing these acts of righteousness, it's very possible that we're simply doing it as a way to show selfish love. Then he says a person will then grow out of this selfish love into loving God for your own sake. So now I'm loving God, but I'm doing it just simply because of my sake. Like I'm still at the center of attention, but God just becomes the means whereby I can get attention. I think those are the kinds of people that Jesus talked about with Lord, Lord. I'm casting out demons. I'm doing all these things. These are people who they're using these kind of religious or Christian forms to get the affirmation that they've wanted anyways. The 3rd degree of love is loving God for God's own sake. So we begin to serve God because this is what God deserves. This is my motive is giving God the glory. That's what we talked about in 5:16 of Matthew. That what we're seeking is the glory of God. And the 4th, and this is probably the most confusing, we won't fully unpack it, but is self-love for God's own sake. See, when we truly love God for His sake, we're going to begin to love ourselves for God's sake, that we recognize that we are people created in the image of God. Now, before we finish up here, I've had a couple of questions via text, and I don't know if that's somebody who's on here right now, but just talk about what we're doing different for worship today. We do have a pre-recorded worship service. The reasons for that, it will be explained in the video. Your best bet at getting access to the recording, we did have it on Facebook. There were some issues there, so it won't be posted on Facebook, but it's on YouTube and also on the church's live stream channel. If you go to the church's website, billingschurch.org/status updates, you'll see the links that you can use. Just a warning, if you go to live stream, don't expect it to go live because it's pre-recorded. You'll need to get into the archives, and then from the archives you can play it. There's also a link there on the church website to YouTube, and you can just play it from there. But before we finish, I just want to see, are there any questions about that plan for worship, how you access it or how you get it? The second thing, just to let everybody know, is that 5 o'clock tonight, we're going to be doing a Zoom call. Again, that information is on the website. 5 o'clock, it's just fellowship. There's not going to be a lesson or a class. It's just going to kind of be just touching base with people and seeing how everybody's doing. Okay, I have from Danielle, if you don't have a Facebook account, it doesn't look like you can leave comments. So it is helpful when you read it back. Okay, good. Thanks, Danielle, for pointing that out. For those of you who are not on Facebook, they won't be seeing the comments. And so, yeah, good idea making sure we read those back. So any questions about how to get access to the worship service, clarifications on this class, or questions about the Zoom conversation tonight, we'll just hang around here for a minute and make sure that there's no questions before we finish. If you don't have questions, you can go ahead and sign out, and that will be my sign that people have asked all the questions they have to ask. Gay says, thank you for making this work. I certainly appreciate it. We're learning as we go along. Actually, this Wednesday night, we'll be doing a Zoom class instead of a Facebook Live class, just to get a sense of the feel. In that one, you should be able to ask questions rather than type questions. Jerry, you're most welcome. Again, I won't purport to say that we know what we're doing, but I will let you know that we're doing our best to try and figure out things as we go along. Thank you. You guys are certainly welcome. All right, if you do have trouble tracking down the worship service just because we're doing a little bit different, you can send me a text or give me a call, and I won't put it over the internet since this will be recorded, but you should have access to that. If you don't, I'm sure you can find someone who does. But again, if you have any trouble tracking down how to access the worship service, please let me know. We can get you directed in the right direction. And then anybody who wants to, tonight at 5 o'clock, just a Zoom chat to check in with everyone. God bless everyone. Have a great day.